Yeah.
Welcome everyone to a wonderful new semester, CBS seminar, a wonderful new room. Today we have one speaker, and that speaker is Winston, who's a second year grad student, and we'll be playing work with Fred and James. Brian's talk will be like around a half hour, so we'll go not to the full end, but not just like to the half hour. And I'll be bringing questions as a reminder. Anyone can raise their hand, but like if you notice you're being called on or not being called on, we might be prioritizing the questions of trainees or who haven't spoken yet. So maybe if you have a chance to say something, that might let you back to the line to let other people speak. And we'll start to keep that practice as we go forward through the semester. But now I will turn things over to Brian, whose talk is titled Similarity of the Psychedelic Experience Across People.
Thank you, Chaz, and hello everyone. Good to see you all in this lovely room. So yeah, like Chaz said, the title of my talk is the Similarity of the Psychedelic Experience Across People. I'll be talking about some work that I did with Fred and Janice. And I didn't time the talk, I think it's about half an hour. So if you get bored at any moment, there should be small bags of mushrooms. Yeah, so some of you guys check. Sorry. So the motivating question here is, we know from anecdotal reports and some questionnaire data that there's actually a lot of similarity in the types of things that people report experiencing under the effects of psychedelic drugs. But what we don't know is to what extent these similar changes are driven by systematic changes in brain activity caused by the drugs across people. So that's kind of our motivating question for today's talk. So in terms of the outline, since this is probably many of your first times attending a talk on psychedelic drugs, I'll first just start by defining what psychedelics are and some motivations behind why we study them. I'll describe sort of what the field and the literature has to say as far as accounts of psychedelics effects on large-scale brain activity. And then hopefully I'll convince you that we can go further in answering that question I posed using stimulus locked neuroimaging data. And then we'll get into conclusions and future directions. Okay, so this first section here, what are psychedelics and why do we study them? So for the majority of this talk, I'll be talking about psilocybin. Psilocybin is a naturally occurring compound found in many species of mushrooms. And it's one of a handful of compounds that falls under the category of psychedelic drugs. And because it's found in many varieties of mushrooms, it has this nickname, magic mushrooms or shrooms, so you might have heard it referred to like that. Okay, and so this is not going to be a clinical talk by any stretch, but I want to just spend one slide talking about the clinical studies that we've done at Johns Hopkins and at other institutions. So psychedelics have shown some pretty impressive promise in early studies for treating various psychiatric conditions. So I'll just go over a few of the things that distinguish psychedelics from other types of traditional pharmaceuticals, let's say. So first of all, again, in early studies, psychedelics have shown promise in treating a variety of psychiatric conditions. So in other words, their effects seem to be transdiagnostic. So they've shown efficacy in treating, for example, mood disorders like depression, substance use disorders like nicotine addiction, alcohol use, and also possibly other categories of disorders that we're studying in a lot. Furthermore, their effects seem to be rapid, which is really important. So again, if you compare this to traditional pharmaceuticals, let's say SSRIs, which most people have heard about, they're the most commonly prescribed antidepressant medication. Those drugs can often take weeks, if not months, to start working. So imagine if you're a psychiatrist and somebody is really depressed, and they come to you and you tell them, hey, take this pill every day, it might start working in a month. It's really like not ideal, right? And so with psychedelics, again, in these early studies, what we're seeing is this rapid therapeutic effect, which is potentially really helpful for patients. Furthermore, the effects seem to be durable after only limited administrations. So again, compare this to traditional pharmaceuticals, SSRIs, for example, you have to take a pill every day. In our studies with psilocybin and psychedelics, we see long-lasting benefits in many cases after just 1 or 2, maybe 3 administrations. Okay, but that's not why we're here, right? This is a cognitive science, psychology, cognitive kind of talk. And I think psychedelics are like incredibly fascinating and also underexplored from a cognitive science perspective. It would be impossible to give an exhaustive list of all of the things that happen to people when they take psychedelic drugs. But I wanted to highlight a few of them that I think might be of interest to this audience. So, for example, in the domain of sensation and perception, it's very common for people to report experiencing hallucinations and enhanced mental imagery. And these hallucinations and mental imagery can happen in any sensory domain. So it can get kind of weird. But if we're just thinking about the visual domain to start, you could imagine a visual hallucination. A simple visual hallucination might be seeing, for example, geometric forms in your field of view. Whereas a more complex hallucination or mental imagery might feel more like a waking dream. So it might involve seeing people and more like higher level concepts, and it might be kind of symbolic in nature and have an emotional tone to it. And we see that a lot come up in our clinical studies. As far as just basic visual effects when people's eyes are open, people tend to experience increased brightness and saturation of objects in the world. Objects might be moving around and there might be tracers following the objects. It's also very common for people to experience synesthesia under the acute effects of psychedelics, which is pretty interesting given that someone, for example, who does not ever normally experience synesthesia can have and experience it under the acute effects of these drugs. And then finally, I want to just mention this idea that has been called a peak experience or a mystical experience. And I know this sounds like kind of a fuzzy, ill-defined concept, but this is actually something that can be empirically categorized. So there's a mystical experience questionnaire that exists, and if participants in a study endorse a certain amount of that criteria on that questionnaire, you can consider them to be having a complete mystical experience. And so I could talk more about the dimensions of the mystical experience if people are interested. Have an extra slide on it. But for now, I'll mention just one of the most salient aspects or dimensions of the mystical experience, which is this idea of ego dissolution or unity. So this is essentially what it means is there's a transient loss in the sense of self that people feel. And so this can be very impactful for people, and it also tends to correlate with, but mystical experience in general tends to correlate with therapeutic outcome. So I won't be talking too much about this peak experience, mystical experience idea, but I just wanted to mention it as an important aspect of what psychedelics do. As I said, there's no exhaustive list of what psychedelics do to the mind and brain, but I think this is pretty much as close as you can get. So this is the subjective effect index from the Psychonaut wiki. So obviously this is not like a scientific peer-reviewed resource, right? But it's like very detailed, and it's something that the community has put together, and I find it helpful just to see what like people are reporting out there in the world. And it's kind of a fun read, so you can check it out. Okay, but back to this motivating question that I started. So I described just now all of these interesting and weird effects that psychedelics have on the mind and the brain. But to what extent are these effects driven by systematic changes in brain activity elicited by the drugs? So now I'm going to go over what the literature and the field has to say as far as what psychedelics do to large-scale brain activity. And so I'll start with just one hypothesis here that exists.
Is there anyone out there who still isn't clear about what doing drugs does? Okay, last time. This is your brain. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
In the talk. So, obviously I showed that as a joke, but, actually maybe he's not that far off. So the semi-psychedelic drug MDMA causes brain hyperthermia. So it literally heats up your brain. Okay. But we're here to talk about psychedelics like psilocybin, right? And so what I think that video had wrong about the effects of psilocybin is more just the method of cooking the egg. So Fred wanted me to take out this slide because let me just, for the record, say that I don't think psychedelics literally scramble your mind or scramble your brain. But I think it's actually not the worst analogy. Mainly it's just so I can make this egg joke. But let me explain why I think it's not the worst analogy. So what do people report in the literature about what psychedelics do for large-scale brain activity? Well, people report decreased functional connectivity within and increased functional connectivity between large-scale brain networks. So let's break down what that means. So first of all, brain networks are distributed sets of regions whose activity is coupled together over time. So let's say this red region and the blue region are members of the same network. You could see that their activity over time is relatively coupled. So maybe they're members of the same network. Now, if you bring psychedelics on board, suddenly that connectivity goes down. So it's kind of a loss of this regular organizational structure in the brain. Now, let's say you have two brain regions that are normally not part of the same network. Normally their activity is not coupled. Now you bring psychedelics on board and suddenly they're more coupled. So it's kind of like a reversing of what's normally going on, or loss of this regular organizational structure that you find. Furthermore, there's been a big deal made about increased entropy of fMRI and electrophysiological signals. And entropy could be measured in a lot of different ways, and I can get into that if people are interested. But for now, you can sort of think about it as a decrease in the predictability of many metrics of studying functional brain activity. I think another helpful thing that has been reported in the literature is less variance explained by common dimensionality reduction techniques like principal components analysis and k-means clustering when applied to whole brain time series data. So all these things are kind of converging on, all these metrics are converging on sort of a loss of the regular organizational structure in brain activity. Things are getting a bit messy. But we haven't noticed that actually doesn't really help us answer this motivating question, which was about systematic effects across people. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Mainly, these are all resting state brain metrics. And so it's hard to make any inferences about what's happening to systematic changes in perception or systematic changes in various aspects of cognition if you don't actually know what people are doing in the scanner and you're not controlling it across people. So we actually think it's going to be much more useful to answer this question that I posed at the beginning about systematic changes across people by using stimulus-driven signals. And so the obvious benefit is, first of all, you actually know what people are doing in the scanner. So any changes that you see in brain activity, you know, are related to, okay, you know, at least people are doing stimulus processing, you're controlling the stimulus, and everybody is exposed to the same stimulus. And then, so when you want to look for systematic changes across people, you can do that because you know when everybody is in my case, it's gonna be music listening data, so you know when everybody is listening to the same songs, the same parts of the song, and you're constraining cognition and linking brain activity to cognition in that way. So now I'm gonna show what I did. So just to explain the data set a little bit, this was data that Fred and some other people collected back a few years ago. It was a study of 19 long-term meditators. I don't actually take into account the fact that there were meditators in this study, but just to mention that that's who the participants were. So each subject completed 2 fMRI sessions. It was a within subject design. For that one session, participants were administered 10 milligrams of open label psilocybin. 10 milligrams is a low to moderate dose. And then at the other time point, people were administered a placebo. Each participant completed 5 fMRI scans, 1 resting state, 1 music listening, and 3 types of meditation. For this analysis, I'll just be using the music listening data. So to explain just a little bit more about that. Importantly, each subject listened to the same songs on the placebo day, or the placebo session, as well as the psilocybin session, and then many of the subjects listened to the same songs as each other. And the songs were about 90 seconds long each. There's a mix of classical and ambient music. Okay, so this metric that we're gonna use to look at these systematic effects across people is called intersubject pattern correlation. I don't know if there's been any talks using this exact method, maybe at some point, but I'll give kind of a high level overview of it and then describe how we actually calculated it. So broadly, it's a measure of intersubject similarity of the brain response to music using multivoxel patterns in every region of the cortex. What we're going to do is run this analysis separately for the placebo data and the psilocybin data. And then it's going to allow us to ask this question: are psilocybin's effects idiosyncratic across people, or are they actually similar across people? And so you can think about, even before I describe in detail how we did this, if this measure of intersubject correlation goes down in a particular region, that might suggest that psilocybin, at least in that region, is having an idiosyncratic different effect across people. Whereas if this measure of intersubject correlation goes up, well, then things get a little more interesting. Maybe this is a systematic effect of the drug. We'll get more into details of how to interpret the results. So now just to describe how we actually calculate this metric, the PISC, intersubject pattern correlation. What we're going to do is start by breaking each song up into 11-second events. So let's say the song has like 6 events. And then what we're going to do is in each region of the cortex, we're going to look at the multivoxel pattern in that region during each event. So let's say in this particular region, during this event, this was the pattern, second event, this was the pattern, and so on. Okay, so now if we just focus on the first event, again, here's that pattern in the region. Now what we're going to do is look at that same process in all these other subjects that are in the study. So let's say this guy's pattern, again, during this event in that region looks like this guy's like this, so on. We're going to average these patterns, and then we're going to look at the correlation between the individual and the group during this event. We're going to do that for all the events and just average all of those correlations. And this is kind of going to be like a leave one out analysis. So again, right now, comparing the individual to the group average. Then next, we're going to take this participant and again, calculate that correlation at every event with the group average. And so what we're going to do is just average over all the events and all the people. Okay. After doing that, you end up with one PISC value, level of intersubject pattern correlation during music listening at each region of the brain. So here's a map of, for example, what the placebo data look like. Remember, we did this separately for placebo and psilocybin. So here's the placebo map. So as you can see, just from a brief glance, I don't know how the glare is, but the the highest levels of PISC across the brain are in auditory cortex, which is unsurprising given that this is a music stimulus, right? But now we have to determine which regions actually show significant levels of PISC. So what we're going to do is run a permutation test. So if you remember, to do this analysis, we were comparing, event 1 in the individual with event 1 in the group. What we're going to do is, for each iteration of the permutation test, we're going to scramble the event labels. So, for example, let's say we scramble the labels, and now event 1 in the individual is going to be paired with event 5 in the group. And so our kind of null hypothesis here is that if you have a particular region would not be considered to have significant PISC if you scramble the event labels, and there's no difference between the true observed value with the correct event labels and then these scrambled values. So if we run this permutation test 2,000 times, scrambling the event labels in each iteration, we get this null distribution. And then let's say this is an example region. I think this is probably an auditory region. Again, we scramble the event labels, get this distribution, but the true observed PISC value when you have the correct matched event labels is all the way over here. So clearly this is a significant region. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the results. So here's the brain, and let me walk you through what these different colors mean. So you see these red regions. These red regions are the ones where we saw significant PISC in the placebo condition, but not in the psilocybin condition. So we kind of expected these regions going in. If psilocybin is having an idiosyncratic effect across people, then the level of PISC is going to go down in that region. So that's kind of what we think is going on in these red regions. But as you can see, there's also some of these blue regions, and there's much fewer of them, but they do exist. And so PISC in these regions is significant in the psilocybin condition, but not in the placebo condition. So potentially, these are systematic effects of psilocybin across people in these regions. But let's say you don't believe me about these blue regions. I want to show you more compelling evidence that actually there are systematic effects of psilocybin across people. And so to do that, I want to focus on these purple regions. So you can see some purple regions over here. These purple regions, we saw significant PISC in the placebo condition and also significant PISC in the psilocybin condition. But there's actually an ambiguity here. There's two possibilities for what could be happening in these purple regions. So the first possibility is that the patterns are basically the same within each drug condition and also across drug conditions. So for example, let's say all of the placebo people are thinking about this cat and some brain areas representing them. And let's say all the psilocybin people are also thinking about this same cat. That region would show up as purple because it's synchronized within each drug condition independently. However, these purple regions could just as easily be here. Let's say the psilocybin people are all thinking about this cat, and then all the psilocybin people are thinking about, I don't know, the multiverse and God or whatever. But the important thing is that they're all thinking about the same thing. They're all thinking about the same thing. So in these purple regions, it could be either of these possibilities going on. I would argue that this latter possibility is much more interesting because this would represent a systematic effect of the drug across people. So the way that we're going to actually identify, disentangle these two possibilities is by looking at the PISC across drug conditions. So if you remember before, we were comparing everybody's placebo data to everyone else's placebo data. This is the PISC within drug conditions. That's what we did before to get that map. Now we're going to do PISC across drug conditions. So we're going to be comparing, for example, an individual's placebo data to the group's psilocybin data. This will allow us to get a measure of how similar are the patterns across drug conditions, specifically in those purple regions. Okay, so before we go through this, this is just a reminder of our previous results. And these are the same purple regions as over here. But you might notice that there's kind of this like light purple and then there's a darker purple. So in the light purple regions, we see high PISC within each drug condition from before, remember, and we also see high PISC across drug conditions. So this is maybe more like the first possibility where both groups are thinking about the same cat, right? It's pretty much just the same pattern within drug conditions and across drug conditions. However, let's check out these dark purple regions. These dark purple regions, we see again high PISC within each drug condition independently, but when you compare across drug conditions, correlation is basically zero, in some cases negative. So to me, this is clearly a systematic effect of the drug across people in these regions. Just to kind of underscore this, these regions synchronize to one pattern in the placebo condition, but a different one in the psilocybin condition. Okay, so you might be wondering what this like orangish overlay is that I haven't talked about yet. So I was trying to kind of contextualize what was going on with these regions, and I thought I kind of saw this like spatial gradient from kind of the lighter purple to the darker. And so this overlay that I have here is a temporal receptive window map. So if you've attended any of Janice or Chris's labs talks, you've heard about temporal receptive windows. Basically what it is the duration of time that a region integrates stimulus information over. So for example, auditory cortex integrates information over very short timescales in the stimulus, whereas higher level regions, for example, in the default mode network, integrate information over much longer timescales. And so I thought what we were observing here was that the patterns were pretty similar across drugs in these like sensory auditory cortex kind of regions. But in the higher level regions, it seemed like that's where these systematic effects across people were taking place. So then when I actually plotted the relationship between the PISC across drugs and the TRW, I got this suspiciously high correlation here, strong effect, where it seemed like these, again, these regions that were showing systematic effects across people were selectively in these higher order, longer TRW regions. Okay, so that's pretty much the results. Now, just to summarize here, what I said before, many of the current findings and current state of the literature in the psychedelic field is relying on resting state brain metrics. So it wasn't really helpful for answering our question. So when we expose subjects to a shared stimulus, it reveals these blue regions, which we didn't necessarily expect to find, that synchronize on, spatially synchronize on psilocybin, but not placebo. And furthermore, we found these dark purple regions that showed somewhat compelling evidence that there are systematic effects across people by the drug. And it seemed to be selectively in these regions that integrate information over longer timescales. So this kind of suggested to us that it's possible that psilocybin may be causing all these interesting effects on perception and various aspects of cognition by altering the integration of information rather than just the mere sensation. As far as some future directions, the first thing I want to do is just replicate these results in another music listening data set. There's not many psychedelic music listening data sets out there, as you might imagine, but I want to just see if this effect is real. And but much more excitingly, we're collecting a movie watching data set. So we're collecting over an hour of movies a similar design as the music data that I presented, but it'll be a double-blind crossover study where people will watch over an hour of movies on placebo and an hour of movies on psilocybin, and everybody's watching the same movies. So we'll be able to further answer this question that I posed before, replicate these results, and as well as answer many, many more questions. Kind of a bigger question that these findings raise is what is actually happening in these dark purple regions where there's like a systematic effect across people. And it's kind of hard to reverse engineer like what people are actually thinking about, what's going on in their heads. One idea we had was, well, maybe, for example, in the music data, people are representing a different acoustic feature of the music for that. Perhaps that's what's going on, or they're attending to a different part of the music. I think we'll be able to better answer what these regions are actually representing, what these changes might actually, what might be underlying them in the movie data. So beyond just collecting the imaging data, we're also collecting some behavioral data. So for example, at the end of the day, at the end of people's drug administration day, they'll do a free recall of the movie, so they recall everything they remember about the movie, what emotions they're experiencing during it, maybe their interpretations. And so it might be interesting to see if, for example, we see a systematic pattern shift in a high level region, and then that also bears out in the behavioral data. Maybe the people on psilocybin all have a different shared interpretation of the movie. That's just something that might happen, but we'll have to see. Okay, that's the end. Thank you for your attention. Big thank you to Janice and Fred for your advising. And to the Chen and Honey Lab, I love working with you guys. And Laura Doyle, Kishore, and Taylor, who collected the imaging data. I haven't met Kishore and Taylor because it was years ago, but I hope they're doing well. Of course, the participants and ChatGPT has been helpful through every step of the process, so thank you. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Brian. This is super cool. You talked mostly about the purple bits.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about some of the other bits. So I can't remember what the colors are, but I don't expect you to go into a huge spiel about what all these different bits mean. But can you pick an example of some of the blue bits and what you think it means that they're more active during the drug? I'm just curious about what if it gives any other clues as to what's happening in the brain when people are on this.
Yeah, that's a really important question, and like I really don't know what's happening in these blue regions, and that's why I'm really excited to dig into the movie data set, because it's kind of hard to think about like what could be something that all of the psilocybin people are representing that the placebo people aren't. I think maybe it's a possibility that they are like attending to different parts of a song, for example, or maybe a different acoustic feature of it. So, you know, in classical music, maybe like a different instrument. I'm not totally sure what's going on. So this is like also a pretty small data set. So I'm really curious again with the movie data, like how many of these blue regions there will be. I will note though that something interesting is that almost all of the blue regions are in the right hemisphere, and there've been a lot of disparate findings in the psychedelic literature about psychedelics disproportionately affecting the right hemisphere. And so I don't know if there's anything to make of this, but it was interesting that like pretty much all of these blue regions were in the right hemisphere. But I don't really know what's going on.
So to assume and see Earlier you mentioned that there are studies showing that there are long lasting effects after, one dose of
Yeah.
psilocybin. And I was just wondering if you have any plans to invite the people that you scan initially back to the scanner like a month or so after you have the drug treated scanning session, and to see if you can compare the placebo condition like before and after the treatment and see any long lasting effects.
Yeah, I think Fred actually kind of has like one of the better papers on this, like showing changes out to 1 month after psychedelic administration. We don't have any plans to do that like with these studies, but I think maybe Fred might be able to say better like what you found in that 1 month out study.
Yeah, just briefly, a lot of the effects that we see here in the acute effects of, I'm not sure what's, oh, hey, yeah, a lot of the effects we see during the acute effects of psychedelics are pretty enormous. They're large effect sizes. I like to think of psilocybin as like a huge sledgehammer for effect sizes, because people are in this radically altered state of consciousness, and hopefully almost all people after that effect is over come back to their typical state of consciousness. And a month later, people are not, if you'll forgive me, they're not walking around having these kind of tricking experiences, which is great. Right, right, but that from that point, the effects on cognition seem to be subtle, and they're going to take a much larger kind of data set than we currently have to really well characterize. But for the we've now conducted 2 studies, one in healthy participants and one in patient populations, where we've observed measurable increases in cognitive flexibility performance in a variety of tasks, measurable differences, at least a week later, in dynamic functional connectivity in a few regions involved in cognitive control. In the healthy participants, those are depressed patients. In the healthy participants, we've seen more subtle effects that are numerical effects that seem to be going in a specific direction, but out of the small sample, we couldn't find anything like really super strong, or it hasn't been replicated yet, but effects on cognition and cognitive control with associated brain changes do seem to be lingering weeks and months after.
Right,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, it's like, I would say a really big goal of the field so these are all like basically acute data that I was describing here, but a big goal of the field is we see these like large behavioral changes, especially in clinical studies. And so to be able, clearly something with brain activity is changing to underlie these large behavioral changes and changes in mindset and things like that. There's a whole kind of arm of the field trying to look at these pre-post changes and long lasting.
Very nice, thanks. So did the subjects report experiences while they were listening, and some cases under the psilocybin effects, like were they reporting synesthesia, like associations with colors or numbers, or something with the sounds they were listening to, or other effects? What you might apply to some of the.
Yeah, well, what we did collect was emotion ratings after every song. So after every song was played, people rated how much joy they felt, nostalgia, how much they liked it, things like that. And I did analyze those data, and people on many of these positive emotions, people went way up on the psilocybin dose. They liked the songs more, they felt more joy, awe, things like that. I don't know if we, I actually wasn't even in the lab when we collected these data, so I don't know what people reported as far as, like you're saying, kind of these synesthetic like experiences, or what they were imagining in their minds when they were listening to this music. I know from hearing some of the reports from the meditation scans. So again, these were long-term meditators in the study, and they did meditation in the scanner on psilocybin. And I've read excerpts from some of the reports with people describing some really amazing things, like reliving some of their most intense meditative experiences while on the drug and things like that. But I think, I mean, we are very interested in the synesthesia, and so it would, it would be, it's just really hard to predict what people are going to experience. So, you know, we could have a bunch of people listen to music and then, you know, describe maybe what's happening as far as they're visualizing. I think that would be really interesting. I don't know if we actually catalog that, you know, so.
I do, I have a question. I have that was really fun and a lovely talk. I have an interpretive question, so, you know, it's really interesting that this pattern data is really interesting and you invite some speculation about what this coherence and the psilocybin reflects. So I was wondering if you've thought about, or if you've already ruled out the following, maybe less interesting, I don't know, interpretation, which is like, if people who sign up for the study know that they're gonna be given drug or placebo,
Yep.
and they're like waiting to experience the effects, and they're hearing music, and they're thinking about what they're experiencing. And so, could it be the case that they actually have like some low level, say, perceptual changes, but they're thinking about what they're experiencing a lot. That's like a higher order kind of thinking that's integrating across,
Yeah.
you know, it's like metacognizing about what is this I'm feeling and so on, and all of that group should be feeling that if there's some lower level change, whereas placebo group might not be, because they're not experiencing that change. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if that is relevant, and if an interesting comparison would be psilocybin versus some other drug that isn't known to create these like closer to God experiential changes, but just changes something sensory so that you don't predict that.
Yeah, I think that would be really smart, and I don't really know if we could roll out that first thing that you described, and that would explain the same thing, like pretty much the same patterns in lower level sensory areas, but then in the higher level areas, maybe a difference. And this was actually an open label study, so it wasn't, our movie study is gonna be double blind. Although it's really hard to blind.
It's open label study mean,
Oh, it means we just told them, okay,
so
now
you
you're
know
gonna
what
get,
they're gonna be on.
Yeah. Yeah. We told them, okay, you're gonna get placebo now you're gonna get psilocybin. Our movie, yeah, our movie data, watching data set is double blind, so they don't know what they're gonna get, we don't know what they're gonna get.
Mhm.
But realistically, it's like kind of obvious. So, yeah, but I like your suggestion of, and I think it's like a really active thing that we're trying to do in the lab is to have more active placebos, like maybe cannabis or methylphenidate. So that it's not, you know, totally obvious what people are getting and they're on something that is changing something about their perception and their experience and, yeah, but that's a good alternative explanation for these results.
So on many hands, the two people have been doing it for a while, but we're done.
I think that was a really good talk. I first had a clarification question, then maybe a follow-up. So like, you split your data into like events, right? Like the.
Yeah.
I was wondering how that split up like was done.
Yeah, very boring way I did it in this data set, which was just every 5 TRs, which was every 11 seconds, just splitting it like that. For the movie data set, we have like event segmentations. So we can look at actual like patterns during an event and lean on a lot of the stuff that like Janice has done in her lab and Yoon Jung and other people about like how patterns change in the different events. But for now, we just kind of chunked it.
Right, so like, I mean, my next question is just like, it has to do with event segmentation and like, I'm wondering like, so you have, for the movie data set, you will have like event segmentation from like ordinary subjects that are sober, right?
Yeah,
And I was wondering whether like, the events like how subjects on psilocybin segment events would be different
Yeah.
from normal subjects, and if so, if it's different, then perhaps like using event segmentation data from sober subjects is not gonna like capture like the
Yeah.
experience of events there.
no, that's really interesting, and I guess it would be hard to like have a bunch of people on psilocybin like rate an event segmentation, but something that you could do is a more like data driven technique, which is like using an HMM or something where you can look at where patterns change just based on the data itself. And that's something I 100% plan to do. I could do in this music data set, but definitely in the movie data set. where like, are there neural state boundaries, are those changing in the psilocybin condition? And are those similar across people? Maybe they, like you're saying, have a different idea of when events start and end. Maybe their events are longer or shorter, something like that, yeah.
I actually have a similar question, but it's about how you decide on the journal, like the number of voxels to submit to the analysis, on whether that is predetermined or if you can play around with that and see whether submitting, larger spatial regions, including functional networks or parts of functional networks, could influence your results.
Yes, that's a really good idea too. I just used like a parcellation of 400 regions. And so everything was just based on that. But I really wanted to play around with, for example, different like length of events, different spatial like resolutions would also be really interesting. Is there like a hypothesis that you have maybe or something?
I mean, I assume that submitting smaller locations and larger locations will just yield lower correlation in general, and that there's probably some intermediate
Yeah.
point where you could, but I don't know if you want to dig around that much in the data.
I don't think that would be too hard. Yeah, that's quite, yeah.
Sam, you wanted to chime in?
I had a question about whether you have tested the responses to these stimuli across people over the time course of the drug, because it'd be interesting to know whether some of this activity is based on like metabolically processing the drug or maybe perceptual changes that are happening over the drug's course.
Yeah, we haven't done that. We may be able to add that indirectly with the movie watching data set, just because it's like people are watching movies for an hour, and then we also advance the resting state data. There are certainly some pretty robust changes over the time course of psilocybin. People have shown in terms of like functional connectivity changes, and also in terms of the people's reported experiences. Like, for example, I described the simple hallucinations and complex hallucinations. I know from talking to some people that are, Fred and other people in the center have mentioned just like from, sitting in the room with people while they're on the drug, that like earlier on, people tend to have these more simple hallucinations, and then later on, it's these more like waking dream type experiences. So I think there are interesting changes over the course of something pharmacologically and metabolically happening. I don't know how it would affect this stuff, but it'd be interesting to look at.
Jeremy, you said it.
I was also wondering about cannabis and whether, how much of this is distinctive of psychedelics versus, something else that alters, especially the response to music. But I think you already maybe addressed that in your response to the earlier question.
But yeah, I think cannabis would be like a really cool active control. And I guess there's no reason why people also report similar effects on cannabis to like people report similar effects to each other. So it might not be different.
So that was really, really interesting. Thank you. I had a question just to follow up on Miriam. So I was also wondering about the parcellation of the cortical surface that you were using. And from what you were saying, was that an anatomical parcellation?
Yeah.
It just seemed like, given your hypothesis, which is that one thing that could be going on, that certain regions that are usually synchronized become less so, other regions that are not usually synchronized become more so. It feels like using the resting state data to estimate these intrinsically connected networks like the Randy Buckner way, and then looking across versus within those networks could be a more direct way to test that question.
So like the large scale networks and. Yeah. I mean, in general, I think that brings up something that I've been trying to think about, which is like the relationship between this stuff and functional connectivity in general.
Yeah.
Like, to what extent do we know that psychedelics kind of increase overall functional connectivity across the board? But how that relates to this like level of intersubject correlation is not clear to me right now, but something I want to do. And yeah, it would be interesting if like those regions that kind of come online in the PISC sense are also like coupled to each other or members of the same network.
Or not, right? Because one of the predictions is that deep regions that are normally.
Right, yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and I have a second question, which is those regions that you pointed to and said, look, this is like a really interesting stuff. If you look at the resting state data, do you find, are those effects absent? Because it feels like that's important if you want to argue that these results are really about stimulus activity. So I was wondering about that.
Well, I mean, so you can't really do any of this PISC stuff in the resting state data. There's gonna be no
Right.
synchronicity. So what were you saying, like, might not show up in the?
It just feels like it's somehow would be satisfying to say, look at these boxes and look, they behave differently in a task where there's stimulus on the screen and not the subject subjects. So I can't quite think through exactly the analysis, but I feel like that would be really interesting.
You could do the exact same analysis by 50% thinking.
Yeah. I don't think it would. But yeah, I mean, even just looking at like global functional connectivity or something. Or functional connectivity to each other in the region or something like that. Seeing how that changes when the stimulus is on board versus resting state.
That's all the time we have. Thank you, Johnny.